The letter arrived before the bells of the royal chapel began to toll. It rested on a silver tray sealed in black wax, carrying the faint, suffocating scent of violet powder. Lady Cordelia Sterling looked at the dark seal. The ivory silk of her wedding gown felt heavy, cold against her ribs. She was 24, the sole heir of House Sterling, and in less than an hour she was expected to become the Duchess of the High Court. Her fingers, steady and pale, broke the wax. "Come to the vestry before the bells. V." The handwriting was a heavy, hurried stroke. Valerian. Duke Valerian Blackwood, the man whose cold gray eyes had commanded the realm's armies, yet had never looked at her with anything warmer than duty. Cordelia slipped the note into her silk glove. The diamond comb, a royal heirloom from her late mother, rested securely in her dark chestnut hair. She walked down the long, shadowed corridor of the chapel. The cold marble floor echoed beneath her measured steps. At the turn of the hall, a young footman with fair hair brushed past her. His head was bowed too low for a royal servant. His shoulder caught her sleeve. "Forgive me, my lady," he muttered, vanishing quickly through a side door. Cordelia barely nodded. She reached the heavy oak doors of the vestry. She expected a final instruction regarding the royal protocol. Instead, she opened the door to a silence that would fracture the kingdom. Duke Valerian Blackwood stood in his black velvet morning coat, his sharp jawline rigid. But he was not alone. Lady Rosamond, Cordelia's cousin, stood pressed against him. Rosamond wore pale lilac muslin, her hands gripping the silver crest on Valerian's lapel. Valerian held Rosamond's wrists. He was pushing her away, but the movement was slow. For one fatal second, he looked paralyzed by the tears already spilling from Rosamond's pale blue eyes. The heavy vestry door clicked. Valerian turned. The color drained from his aristocratic face so completely, he looked carved from the same stone as the floor. "Cordelia," he said. His voice was low, laced with a sudden, devastating panic. Rosamond let out a fractured sob and covered her mouth. "I am sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling with perfect, practiced tragedy. "I did not mean for you to see this." Cordelia did not scream. She did not weep. Her dark green eyes took in the scene with the cold precision of, "Oh, judge." Pause. She saw the dust on the table. She saw the silver scent box in Rosamond's hand. She smelled the violets. And then she felt the sudden shift in her hair. The heavy diamond comb, loosened by the tension of the veil, slid from her chestnut curls. It struck the marble floor with a sharp, violent crack. Diamonds scattered like broken glass. One rolled directly to Rosamond's lilac hem. Valerian took a step toward Cordelia, his hand outstretched. "Cordelia, wait. It is not what you think. Let me explain." "Do not touch me, Your Grace," Cordelia said. The title fell between them like a blade. She knelt on the cold marble. Her pristine ivory gown swept over the dust as she picked up the broken silver setting and the scattered diamonds. Valerian stood frozen, his power useless, watching the woman he was supposed to marry kneel in the dust while her rival wept. When Cordelia stood, her white gloves were stained. The veil hung ruined from her hair. She held the broken comb in her fist. Valerian looked at her, calculating the damage, deciding how to control the scandal instead of how to protect her. That silence was his true betrayal. Cordelia turned and walked out of the vestry. She did not flee. She walked with her spine straight, directly into the main hall of the chapel, where half the nobles of Oakhaven sat waiting. The murmurs died instantly as she appeared at the altar alone, her veil torn, her gloves ruined. She did not look at her father. She looked at the high priest. "Yes,
There will be no ceremony today, Cordelia announced, defiant. Her voice did not shake. I will not take vows while lies stand waiting in the shadows. The royal court erupted into chaos, but Cordelia did not stay to listen. She turned and walked out the grand doors, leaving the Duke of the High Court to the ashes of his own silence. Determined, the heavy wooden wheels of the carriage rattled against the cobblestones, carrying Lady Cordelia Sterling away from the ruins of her future.
Inside the opulent cabin, the air was suffocating, thick with the smell of damp wool and unspoken disgrace. Beside her sat her father, the Earl of Sterling. His face was purple with suppressed rage. It was not a father's rage for a daughter's broken heart. It was a nobleman's rage for a broken political alliance. "You should have let the Duke manage the matter," the Earl hissed, his voice tight, fearful that even the carriage driver might hear the scandal. "He is the Duke of the High Court. If you had kept your mouth shut, the families could have controlled the narrative." Cordelia did not look at him. She stared down at her hands. The pristine white silk of her gloves was stained with the gray dust of the chapel floor. "Manage the matter?" Cordelia repeated. Her voice was terrifyingly hollow. "You mean he would have covered it up? He would have married me while protecting her?" "Rosamond is a fragile girl," her father snapped. "Her father, Lord Thorne, is drowning
in gambling debts. This marriage was supposed to secure our house and theirs. Now, Rosamond's tears have bought the sympathy of every noble in Oakhaven. They are already whispering that you are a cold, jealous woman who imagined a betrayal." Cordelia finally turned her head. Her dark green eyes pinned him to his seat. "I imagined nothing. I saw my cousin holding my groom, and I saw my groom hesitating when he should have thrown her out." Frustrated. "It does not matter what you saw."
The Earl struck his silver-tipped cane against the floorboard. "The court only cares about what it can prove. You will go to the countryside tonight. You will remain hidden at the summer estate. Valerian will likely announce an engagement to Rosamond to save Lord Thorne's honor, and you will accept this in silence." Cordelia's spine straightened against the velvet cushions. The corset tightened around her ribs, but her pride burned hotter than the pain. "No," she said softly. The Earl blinked. "Excuse me? I will not be banished to the countryside while a false bride steals my place in the capital. I will not be erased to make their treason convenient." She reached into the cuff of her silk glove. She needed the note, the black waxed parchment with the forged initial, the heavy, sweet scent of violet powder that Rosamond always wore. It was the only proof that the entire scene in the vestry had been a calculated trap. Her fingers touched nothing but empty silk. Cordelia
Frowned. She searched the other glove. She felt the folds of her gown. Panicked. Nothing. The note was gone. A sudden, freezing memory locked her breath. The narrow corridor outside the vestry, the fair-haired footman who had bowed far too low for a royal servant, the heavy, deliberate brush of his shoulder against her arm. It was not an accident. It was a theft. Rosamond had not just staged a betrayal. She had hired a thief to steal the summons, ensuring Cordelia would have no proof of how she was lured to the room.
The false bride had thought of everything, or almost everything. Cordelia opened her small velvet reticule. Inside rested the shattered pieces of her mother's diamond comb. She poured the heavy silver setting and the loose, glittering stones into her palm. With absolute, chilling calm, she began to count them. Her mother's comb held exactly 12 flawless diamonds. She knew every curve, every setting of the royal heirloom. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9, 10, 11. 11 stones. Cordelia's heart stopped, then hammered a new, violent rhythm against her ribs. One diamond was missing. She closed her eyes. The scene in the vestry replayed in her mind with terrifying clarity. The sharp crack of the comb hitting the marble, the diamonds scattering like rain, and one brilliant, unmistakable stone rolling across the floor, coming to a dead stop inside the pale lilac hem of Rosamond's muslin gown. Rosamond had stolen her groom and erased
The letter. But the false bride had unknowingly carried a piece of Cordelia's crown away in her own dress. The evidence was not entirely lost. It was simply waiting to be found. Cordelia closed her fist around the broken jewels. The sorrow in her chest hardened into something sharp, cold, and utterly dangerous. Determined. "Driver!" Cordelia called out, her voice slicing through the rain. "Turn the carriage around," shouting. "You have no authority to do this," her father shouted.
"I am the heir of House Sterling," Cordelia said, her voice dropping into a register of pure royal command. "And we are going back to Blackwood Manor. I have a wedding dress to burn and a diamond to hunt." The heavy iron gates of Blackwood Manor loomed through the freezing rain. Instead of fleeing to the countryside, Lady Cordelia Sterling's carriage came to a sharp, defiant halt at the servants' entrance. She stepped out. The cold rain soaked the shoulders of her ruined ivory silk gown, matting the delicate lace that was already stained with the gray dust of the chapel floor. "My lady, you should not be here," her father shouted from the carriage window, his face pale with panic. "Go home, father," Cordelia said, not looking back. "I will not be a casualty in a war I did not start." She pushed through the heavy wooden doors. The servants' corridors were dimly lit, echoing with the quiet chaos of a royal household whose master's wedding had just publicly collapsed. Cordelia moved with lethal, unhurried purpose. She bypassed the grand marble staircases and walked directly toward the royal sewing room. Inside, Clara, a young, pale seamstress fiercely loyal to House Sterling, jumped as the door slammed shut. Clara was frantically folding swathes of fabric. "Lady Cordelia!" Clara gasped, taking in the torn veil and the muddy hem of the bridal gown. "The steward said you had been banished to the country." "Not yet," Cordelia said, her voice eerily calm. "Where is the pale lilac muslin gown my cousin wore this morning? She complained of a torn hem before the bells." Clara trembled. "Lady Rosamond sent her maid down with it just moments ago. She demanded it be brushed and mended immediately." "Show it to me." Clara hesitated, fearing the wrath of the Duke, but the absolute, cold authority in Cordelia's green eyes left no room for refusal. The seamstress hurried to a long wooden table and pulled back a linen cloth, revealing the lilac gown. Cordelia did not hesitate. She ran her gloved fingers along the heavy, pearl-trimmed hem of the dress. The fabric smelled faintly, sickeningly, of violet powder. "Help me search the lining," Cordelia commanded. For several agonizing minutes, the only sound in the room was the rustle of silk and the driving rain against the window glass. Then Cordelia's fingers stopped. Trapped deep inside a fold of the hem, tangled tightly in a loose blue thread, was a small, hard
object. Cordelia pulled a silver pin from her ruined hair and carefully hooked the thread, tearing it loose. Surprised, a flawless, brilliant-cut diamond dropped into her open palm, the 12th stone. Cordelia stared at the diamond. It was physical, undeniable proof that Rosamond had been standing close enough to the broken comb to catch its debris. It proved she had been in the vestry before the commotion, carefully staging the trap. Tense. The heavy oak door suddenly swung open without a knock. Duke Valerian Blackwood stood in the doorway.
His black velvet coat was darkened by the rain, and his breathing was slightly uneven, a rare crack in his normally terrifying composure. He had been looking for her. His cold, gray eyes swept the room. They landed on Clara, who immediately dropped into a terrified curtsy, then moved to Cordelia. He saw the dust on her ivory gown. He saw the defiant lift of her chin. And finally, he saw the brilliant diamond resting in her hand. Valerian was a man trained in the brutal politics of the high court. It took him less than 3 seconds to read the scene. The lilac gown, the broken comb he had watched her pick up, the missing stone. His sharp jawline tightened. "She staged it," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. The embrace, the tears, it was a calculated theater. "Congratulations, Your Grace," Cordelia said, her tone devoid of all warmth. "Your tactical genius has finally caught up to reality."
Valerian took a step forward. "Cordelia, I remained silent in the vestry because I was calculating how to protect you from the scandal. If I had shouted, the guards would have carried the tale to the nobles within seconds." "You calculated incorrectly," Cordelia replied, closing her fist around the diamond. "You protected your control over the situation, not my dignity. You allowed me to kneel in the dust while a liar wept on your shoulder." Valerian flinched. Sighs. The absolute truth of her words pierced his aristocratic armor. "Then let me fix it now. Give me the stone."
"I will summon the royal guard and have Rosamond escorted from the manor." "No," Valerian stopped. "Cordelia, do not let pride make you foolish." "It is not pride, it is strategy," she said coldly. "One diamond is a coincidence. Rosamond will say it rolled into her hymn by accident. We need the forged note she sent me, and we need the man she paid to deliver it." Before Valerian could argue, Clara let out a small, sharp gasp. The seamstress was staring at the small writing desk near the window. "My lady," Clara whispered, pointing a trembling finger at the polished mahogany. "Look." Cordelia and Valerian stepped closer. There, resting on the dark wood, was a thin, unmistakable dusting of pale violet powder, scattered directly over a discarded sheet of royal blotting paper. The Almax assembly rooms were a gilded battlefield. Beneath 1,000 crystal teardrops hanging from the grand chandeliers, the nobles of Oakhaven gathered not to dance, but to devour.
He latest ruin. Lady Cordelia Sterling did not hide. She entered the grand ballroom alone. She wore a deep emerald green silk gown, entirely devoid of jewels. Her neck was bare, her chestnut hair pinned in stark, elegant simplicity. The velvet reticule hanging from her wrist contained no fan and no powder, only the broken pieces of a diamond comb and a folded sheet of royal blotting paper. The moment she crossed the threshold, the music seemed to thin. Pause. The polite chatter dissolved into a vicious, suffocating silence. Fans snapped shut. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the bride who had abandoned the Duke of the High Court at the altar. Across the room, standing near the orchestra, was Lady Rosamond. She wore a fragile gown of pale blue muslin, surrounded by a circle of sympathetic matrons. As Cordelia entered, Rosamond lowered her head, pressing a lace handkerchief to her eyes with a perfectly calculated tremble. "Good heavens," muttered Lord Moray, a notoriously cruel minister of the royal council, stepping into Cordelia's path. His voice was loud enough for the surrounding nobles to hear. "I had heard the cast-out bride fled to the countryside to hide her humiliation. Yet here she stands, unchaperoned, parading her lost crown." Cordelia's spine locked. The cold marble of the chapel seemed to return to her memory, but she pushed it down. She met the minister's mocking stare with absolute freezing dignity. I left the altar, Lord Moray, Cordelia said, her voice carrying through the sudden quiet of the hall. I did not leave my honor. It takes far more courage to stand in the light than to whisper in the shadows. Moray sneered, his face flushing. Bold words for a woman who imagined a betrayal because she lacked the grace to keep her duke's attention. You will measure your words very carefully, Moray. The voice sliced through the ballroom like a steel blade. Duke Valerian Blackwood stepped out from the crowd.
He wore a dark, immaculate evening coat, his silver signet ring catching the chandelier light. His cold gray eyes locked onto the minister with a level of dark authority that made the surrounding nobles physically step back. "Your Grace," Lord Moray stammered, the color draining from his face. "I was merely—" "You were speaking to Lady Cordelia Sterling," Valerian interrupted, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. "And you will address her with the absolute respect owed to my equal, or you will find yourself permanently removed from this court. Do I make myself clear?" Moray bowed so deeply he nearly lost his footing, murmuring a panicked apology before retreating into the crowd. The ballroom held its breath. Valerian had not defended Rosamond. He had publicly shielded the woman who had humiliated him. Valerian turned to Cordelia. He left a respectful distance between them, his eyes searching hers.
"Or permission." "I did not ask for a rescue, Your Grace," Cordelia said, her tone low and unyielding. "Do not use your guilt to play the hero at my expense." "It was not a rescue," Valerian answered smoothly, though the muscle in his jaw twitched. "It was a correction. I allowed the court to humiliate you once. I will not allow it a second time." Defiant. "My dignity does not require your permission," she replied. "No," he agreed softly, "but my honor requires my action." Pause. Before Cordelia could answer, the heavy crowd of dancers shifted.
A young footman carrying a silver tray of champagne brushed past Cordelia. It was a clumsy movement, entirely unsuited for the royal assembly. Cordelia felt a sudden, sharp pressure against her palm. She did not flinch. She kept her hands perfectly still at her sides. When the footman disappeared into the sea of silk and velvet, she discreetly opened her hand beneath the folds of her emerald gown. It was a small, torn slip of paper. The handwriting was jagged and hurried, entirely different from the forged royal summons. Cordelia lowered her eyes to read the single line of ink. "The fair-haired footman who stole your note was paid from the ledgers of Lord Thorne." Cordelia's breath caught against her corset. Lord Thorne, Rosamond's father. The betrayal was not just the desperate act of a jealous cousin. It was a financed, calculated political assassination by a man drowning in debt. She looked up, her green eyes meeting Valerian's gray ones. The war had just changed. The grand library of Blackwood Manor was a fortress of leather and mahogany, illuminated only by the dying embers of the hearth and a single silver candelabra. Outside, the rain continued to lash against the tall glass windows, burying the sleeping kingdom in darkness. Lady Cordelia Sterling stood beside the heavy oak table. She had not changed out of her emerald green silk gown. The adrenaline of the Almax Ballroom still hummed through her veins, but her face remained a mask of perfect, chilling composure. She opened her velvet reticule and placed her arsenal on the polished wood. First, the 12th diamond, glittering violently in the candlelight. Second, the folded sheet of royal blotting paper, bearing the faint reverse impression of a forged initial. Finally, the crumpled slip of paper handed to her by the unknown footman. Duke Valerian Blackwood stood across from her, his gray eyes sweeping over the evidence. He had removed his evening coat, but his posture retained the rigid, imposing authority of a man who commanded armies. He picked up the torn slip. He read the jagged handwriting once, then twice. Lord Thorn, Valerian said. The name left his lips like a curse. Cordelia met his gaze. Rosamond's tears were the weapon, Your Grace, but her father's desperation pulled the trigger. A forged letter and a staged embrace require money to execute. A fair-haired footman does not risk his neck for a young girl's jealousy. He does it for gold. Valerian turned toward the massive iron vault set into the stone wall of the library. As the Duke of the High Court, he held the financial records of every noble.
Use in Oakhaven. He turned the heavy brass dials, the mechanical clicks echoing loudly in the silent room. Sighs. He pulled out a thick black leather ledger and dropped it onto the table between them. House Thorn has been bleeding wealth for a decade, Valerian said, his long fingers rapidly turning the heavy parchment pages. But 3 months ago, Lord Thorn made a series of disastrous investments in the Eastern trading fleet. The ships sank. The creditors he borrowed from are not polite men of the court.
They are ruthless. Valerian stopped turning the pages. He pressed a gloved finger against a specific line of ink. Cordelia stepped closer, maintaining a careful distance, yet near enough to see the devastating numbers. Lord Thorn owed a fortune, a debt so massive it would result in the complete seizure of his lands, his title, and his freedom. The debt is due at the end of this month, Valerian noted, his voice turning to ice. Unless he can prove an alliance with a house wealthy enough to absorb the ruin. An alliance with the Duke of the High Court, Cordelia finished, the horrifying truth settling over her. She looked at the diamond on the table. It was no longer just a piece of a broken comb. It was the key to a treasonous conspiracy. Lord Thorn had intended to use Valerian's wealth to save his own neck, using his daughter as
the snare. If Valerian had announced an engagement to Rosamond in the vestry to avoid a scandal, he would have bound his bloodline to a bankrupt traitor. I almost handed him the keys to my treasury, Valerian said quietly. Exhales sharply. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He looked at Cordelia, the woman who had walked away from the altar to save her dignity, inadvertently saving his entire legacy in the process. You did not just expose a false bride, Cordelia, he said, his tone heavy with newfound reverence. You stopped a theft against the crown. We have exposed nothing yet, Cordelia reminded him coldly.
A diamond and a scrap of paper are not enough to bring down a noble house. We need the official promissory notes. We need the clerk who manages Lord Thorn's debt to testify before the High Court. Valerian nodded. He moved toward the library doors. My chief steward, Elias, was dispatched an hour ago to secure the master ledger from the lending house. Once we have the clerk's testimony, I will drag Lord Thorn before the council myself. Before Valerian could reach the handle, the heavy doors burst open. Elias, the stoic chief steward, stood in the doorway. His usually immaculate coat was soaked with rain, and his breathing was ragged. Valerian froze. Where is the ledger, Elias? Where is the clerk? Gone, Your Grace, Elias gasped, bowing his head in failure. The lending office was ransacked. The debt pages were torn from the binding, and the clerk has vanished. There is blood on the floor. The library fell into a suffocating silence. Cordelia looked at the flickery.
None candle. Tense. Lord Thorn knew they were hunting. The false bride was no longer just crying in the shadows. The enemy had begun to erase the witnesses. The news of the missing clerk hung in the library like a suffocating shroud. Blood on the floor of the lending house meant Lord Thorn was no longer just a desperate gambler. He was a cornered animal, willing to kill to secure the Duke's treasury. Angry Valerian slammed his fist against the heavy oak table.
The silver candelabra rattled, casting violent, dancing shadows across his sharp jawline. He is erasing the trail. Without the ledger and the clerk, bringing charges of financial treason to the royal council will be my word against a nobleman's. Then we do not use the debt as our weapon, Lady Cordelia Sterling said. Her voice remained eerily calm, a stark contrast to the Duke's simmering rage. We use his daughter's arrogance. She pointed to the sheet of royal blotting paper resting beside the diamond. Look closely at the reversed ink, Your Grace, she instructed. Valerian leaned in. The heavy backward V pressed into the fibers was overly deliberate. Your signature is fluid, born of a lifetime of signing royal edicts, Cordelia observed, her dark green eyes analytical. This stroke is jagged. The pen was pressed too hard into the parchment, the work of a trembling hand trying to mimic
Authority, and the dusting over it. She touched the edge of the paper, her pale finger lifting a trace of the powder. Violet root and crushed heliotrope, Rosamond's signature scent, imported exclusively from the southern ports. No one else in Oakhaven wears it. Forensic proof, Valerian murmured, tracing the edge of the paper without touching the powder. But proof requires a witness to swear where it was found. Surprised, Cordelia's breath suddenly caught against her corset. The emerald silk of her gown rustled sharply as she took a step back. Clara, Cordelia whispered.
Valerian looked at her, confusion flickering in his gray eyes, before terrible comprehension dawned. Clara found the diamond in the hem, Cordelia said, her pulse accelerating into a cold dread. Clara saw the violet powder on the writing desk. If Lord Thorne is willing to shed blood in the city to silence a clerk, he will not hesitate to silence a seamstress inside this very manor. Elias, Valerian barked. But Cordelia did not wait for the Duke or his guards. She grabbed the velvet reticule containing the evidence, gathered the heavy skirts of her emerald gown, and sprinted toward the library doors. She ran through the opulent, shadowed corridors of Blackwood Manor, abandoning all the measured grace expected of a noblewoman. Valerian was immediately on her heels, his long strides easily matching her frantic pace. They descended the narrow stone staircase leading to the servant quarter.
Arters. As they reached the dimly lit sewing room, the sound of shattered glass echoed through the hall. Gasps. Cordelia thrust the door open. Inside, Clara was backed against the stone wall, her pale face streaked with tears of pure terror. Looming over her was a tall, broad-shouldered palace guard, his hand gripping the collar of the seamstress's uniform. His other hand held a drawn hunting dagger. "You didn't see any powder, you stupid girl," the guard hissed, completely unaware of the door opening behind him. "And you didn't find any stone. Say it, or you won't live to see the dawn." Shouting, "Let her go!"
Cordelia's voice did not shake. It rang through the small stone room with the absolute, freezing authority of a true queen. The guard spun around, his eyes widening in shock. He expected to see a terrified noblewoman. Instead, he saw Lady Cordelia standing tall, her chin lifted, her gaze burning with lethal contempt. Before he could even register her presence, Valerian moved. The Duke of the High Court crossed the room in a blur of black velvet. He seized the guard's wrist, twisting it with a brutal, sickening crack. The dagger clattered to the stone floor. Valerian kicked the back of the traitor's knees, sending the heavy man crashing down, and planted his boot firmly on the guard's throat. Clara collapsed, sobbing. Cordelia instantly dropped to her knees beside the girl, wrapping her arms around the trembling seamstress. She did not care that the damp stone floor was ruining her silk gown. "You are safe, Clara," Cordelia whispered fiercely, shielding the servant with her.
Our own body. I swear it on my bloodline. No one will silence you. Valerian looked down at the gasping guard, his gray eyes devoid of mercy. Who gave you the order to threaten my household? The guard, coughing blood, smiled a bloody, desperate smile. It doesn't matter, Your Grace. Lord Thorn has already outplayed you. Angry, Valerian pressed his boot down harder. Explain. A messenger arrived at the main gate 5 minutes ago. The guard choked out. Lord Thorn has officially petitioned the Royal Council.
He demands a high court dinner tomorrow night to formally address the compromise of his daughter's honor. If you do not announce your engagement to Lady Rosamond by the end of the feast, he will publicly accuse Lady Cordelia of madness and treason. Cordelia looked up from Clara, her green eyes locking with Valerian's. The final battlefield had just been chosen. Dawn broke over Oakhaven in a cold gray wash of light, but inside Blackwood Manor, no one had slept. The clock was ticking toward the High Court dinner. By sunset, Lord Thorn would stand before the Royal Council and demand Valerian's hand for his daughter, using Cordelia's ruined reputation as the ultimate leverage. Lady Cordelia Sterling stood by the tall glass windows of the drawing room, watching the rain fade into a freezing mist. She had finally changed out of her ruined emerald silk. She now wore a day dress of severe, unadorned charcoal gray. Her spine was straight, her dark green eyes fixed on the iron gates of the estate. The heavy mahogany doors opened. Duke Valerian Blackwood entered, the silver crest on his coat catching the morning light. Elias found him, Valerian announced, his voice a low rumble of suppressed triumph. Cordelia turned. The footman? Curious. He was trying to board a smuggling vessel at the eastern docks, Valerian said, stepping into the room. Lord Thorn's thugs were a street behind him carrying rusted blades. Elias and my guards reached him first. He is terrified, Cordelia. He believes we brought him here for an execution. Bring him in, she commanded softly. A moment later, 2 armed palace guards hauled the fair-haired footman into the drawing room. He was young, his face bruised and pale with terror. His fake royal livery was torn, soaked in seawater and dockyard mud. The moment the guards let him go, he collapsed to his knees against the velvet rug. "Mercy, Your Grace," the boy sobbed, refusing to look up at Valerian. "I swear I was going to leave the kingdom. You didn't have to send your men to kill me." "My men saved your life, you fool," Valerian said, his voice cold enough to freeze the blood. "The thugs hunting you at the docks belong to Lord Thorn. He leaves no loose ends." The footman froze. He slowly lifted his head, his wide eyes darting between the towering, dangerous duke and the silent, regal woman standing by the window. Cordelia walked forward. She did not raise her voice.
I'd not threaten him. She simply looked down at him with an overwhelming, crushing dignity. "What is your name?" she asked. "T. Thomas, my lady," he stammered. Cordelia reached into her reticule. She withdrew the folded sheet of royal blotting paper and the 12th diamond, placing them gently on the low mahogany table between them. "Thomas," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Yesterday morning, you bumped into my shoulder in the chapel corridor. You stole a black wax note from my glove."
"The woman who gave you that note wore a dress of pale lilac, and she smelled of violet powder. She paid you to deliver the forgery, to steal the evidence, and to vanish." Thomas stared at the diamond, trembling violently. "Lord Thorn's men are waiting outside these walls to slit your throat," Cordelia continued, her green eyes piercing his absolute panic. "The Duke of the High Court can protect you. He can guarantee your safe passage out of Oakhaven. But to earn that protection, I do not want your tears. I want your testimony." Thomas broke. He slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. "She handed it to me herself," Thomas wept, the confession pouring out of him. "Lady Rosamond. She said it was just a harmless prank to test your temper. But the coin came from her father. He paid me in heavy silver to make sure the letter never saw the light of day." The footman reached into his muddy tunic.
With shaking hands, he pulled out a small leather pouch and dropped it onto the table. It landed with a heavy metallic clink. Valerian stepped forward and untied the leather string. He spilled the silver coins onto the mahogany. Stamped clearly on the face of every coin was the twisted thorn and rose crest of House Thorn. Satisfied. "Payment traced directly to his treasury," Valerian said, his gray eyes locking with Cordelia's. They had it. The blotting paper, the diamond, the stamped silver, and the living witness. The forensic chain was unbroken.
"Take him to the secure wing," Valerian ordered his guards. "Guard him with your lives. If he chokes on his own spit before tonight's dinner, I will hold you responsible." As the guards dragged the weeping footmen away, the grand-grandfather clock in the hall began to chime. Evening was falling. The high court dinner awaited. Cordelia turned away from the table. "I must prepare," she said quietly. "Cordelia!" Valerian called out, stopping her at the door. He looked at her, entirely stripped of his usual arrogance. "Tonight, the Royal Council will expect you to break under Thorne's accusations. They will expect a weeping bride." Cordelia reached into her pocket and pulled out the shattered diamond comb. She traced the jagged, broken silver where the 12th stone belonged. "They will not get a weeping bride, Your Grace," Cordelia said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a death sentence for her enemies. "They will."
"I'll get a reckoning." The grand dining hall of Blackwood Manor was a theater built for political slaughter. Beneath 3 cascading crystal chandeliers, the long mahogany table was set with heavy silver and wilted white roses, a cruel mockery of the wedding breakfast that never was. The highest ministers of the Royal Council sat in velvet-backed chairs, their faces illuminated by flickering candlelight. Duke Valerian Blackwood sat at the head of the table. He wore a high-collared black coat, his expression a mask of impenetrable ice.
Lady Cordelia Sterling sat to his right. She did not wear the subdued charcoal gray of the morning, nor the emerald of the ballroom. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk, dark as a starless sky, utterly devoid of lace or ruffles. And pinned directly into the heavy coils of her chestnut hair was the broken diamond comb. The empty socket where the 12th stone belonged was proudly, devastatingly visible. It was a statement of war. She was not hiding her ruin, she was wearing it. Across the table sat Lord Thorne and his daughter. Lady Rosamond wore a gown of pure, innocent white, her blonde hair falling in soft curls. She looked like a fragile saint surrounded by wolves. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the clink of crystal goblets. Finally, Lord Thorne pushed his chair back and stood. The scraping of wood against the stone floor echoed like a gunshot. "My lords of the council," Lord Thorne began, his voice dripping wit.
Each practiced sorrow. "We are gathered tonight because a grave injustice has been committed. My family's honor has been dragged through the mud to spare the pride of a single, deeply confused woman." He gestured toward Cordelia, though he did not dare look her in the eye. "Yesterday, my daughter was compromised," Thorne continued, shouting, his voice rising to ensure every minister heard. She was found in a private room with His Grace, the Duke of the High Court.
Instead of acting with the grace expected of a noble bride, Lady Cordelia threw a hysterical fit, abandoned the altar, and plunged this kingdom into scandal. The ministers murmured. A few cast disapproving glances at Cordelia. She did not blink. She sat perfectly still, her green eyes fixed on the flickering candle before her. Valerian's hand tightened around the stem of his wine glass. The crystal groaned under the pressure. "It is true," Rosamond whispered. She stood slowly, clutching a white lace handkerchief. A single, flawless tear slipped down her cheek. "I never meant to hurt my cousin, but when Valerian took my wrists, he did not pull away. He looked at me with such tenderness. And then Cordelia opened the door. She was so angry, so jealous. She shattered her own mother's comb in a rage." Rosamond covered her face, releasing a muffled, heart-wrenching sob. "I am ruined because I loved a man who was trapped in an arranged love."
Alas, marriage! The dining hall erupted into hushed, scandalous whispers. The trap had snapped shut. By turning Cordelia into a jealous, unstable woman, Rosamond made her own treachery look like tragic, destined love. The Lord Chancellor of Oakhaven, a man with a severe, hollowed face, leaned forward. Serious. "These are heavy accusations, Lord Thorne, but the scene in the vestry is a matter of public record."
"Lady Cordelia, if you cannot prove that this was a deception, Crown law dictates that a compromised noblewoman must be offered the protection of marriage. You must step aside to restore the Duke's honor." The threat was absolute. Yield the title or be destroyed. Lord Thorne slammed his hand on the table, sensing victory. "I demand justice from the council. The Duke must announce his engagement to Rosamond tonight." Valerian shifted his weight. His gray eyes darkened to the color of a winter storm. He prepared to stand, ready to deploy his terrifying authority and annihilate Thorne where he stood. But before the Duke could move, he felt a subtle, absolute shift in the air. Lady Cordelia Sterling rose to her feet. She did not tremble. She did not raise her voice to shout over the murmuring nobles. She simply stood, tall and regal in her midnight blue silk, the broken diamond comb catching the chandelier light. The sheer, terrifying weight of her dignity forced the room into instant, breathless silence. "You demand justice, Lord Thorne," Cordelia said, her voice echoing off the stone walls like a silver bell. "And you claim I shattered my own comb in a fit of jealous rage." "The whole court knows it," Thorne sneered. Cordelia smiled. It was a cold, ruinous smile that made Lord Thorne's breath catch in his throat. "Then it is time the court met the man who picked up the pieces," Cordelia said. She turned her gaze to the far end of the hall. "Elias, open the grand doors. Our uninvited guest has arrived." The heavy oak doors of the dining hall groaned as Elias pulled them open. Two armed palace guards marched into the flickering chandelier light, dragging a bruised, trembling figure between them. The nobles gasped. Lady Rosamond's delicate hands froze on her lace handkerchief. The color drained completely from her flawless face. Thomas, the fair-haired footman, fell to his knees on the polished stone floor. "Who is this vagabond?" Lord Thorne blustered, his voice cracking with a sudden, desperate panic. "What is the meaning of this interruption, Your Grace?" Duke Valerian Blackwood did not answer. He remained seated, his cold gray eyes fixed on Thorn with the patience of an executioner watching the blade fall. Lady Cordelia Sterling stepped away from her chair. The midnight blue silk of her gown whispered against the stone. She approached the center of the table, commanding the absolute attention of the entire high court. "This is Thomas," Cordelia announced, her voice echoing with crystal clarity. "A man hired from the dockyards to wear a false royal livery yesterday morning. Tell them, Thomas. Tell the royal council what you were
I'd to do." Thomas kept his head bowed, terrified of the Duke's silent wrath, but he pointed a shaking finger directly at the saintly figure in white. Sobbing, "She paid me," Thomas sobbed, his voice carrying through the deadly silence. "Lady Rosamond, she handed me a letter sealed in black wax. I was ordered to bump into Lady Cordelia in the chapel corridor and steal a note from her glove. I swear it. She said it was a prank, but she paid me in heavy silver to disappear." "Lies," Lord Thorn roared, slamming his fists on the table. Angry, "He is a paid actor, a street rat bribed to slander my bloodline." Valerian finally moved.
He reached into his dark coat and threw a heavy leather pouch onto the mahogany table. It hit the wood with a deafening metallic crash. The pouch spilled open, scattering heavy silver coins across the white table runner. Every minister leaned forward. The twisted thorn and rose crest of House Thorn was stamped clearly on the silver. "Payment from your own depleted treasury, Thorn," Valerian said, his voice a low, lethal rumble. Rosamond began to shake. "No, Valerian, please, you must believe me." "I believe forensic proof," Cordelia interrupted coldly. She reached into her reticule and laid the royal blotting paper on the table. "A forged summons was sent to me, signed with the Duke's initial. We found this in the Manor's sewing room. It bears the reverse impression of the forgery, pressed so hard the pen nearly tore the paper, and across the ink, a dusting of violet root and crushed heliotrope. Your signature sent, Roz."
"Amend." The Lord Chancellor stared at the paper, his hollow face hardening into disgust. "A forged decree. This is treason against the crown." Shouting. "She is hysterical," Thorn shouted, sweat beading on his forehead. "Even if there was a note, it does not erase the vestry." Cordelia broke her own mother's comb in a jealous rage. Cordelia's green eyes darkened. She raised her hand to her hair, touching the broken silver setting pinned in her chestnut coils. Slowly, she opened her other hand and placed the flawless 12th diamond on the dark wood of the table.
"My comb shattered on the marble floor," Cordelia said softly. "But this stone did not stay in the vestry. I found it sewn tightly into the hem of the pale lilac muslin gown my cousin wore yesterday morning, a gown she changed out of immediately after her performance. It is a physical impossibility for this diamond to be in that hem unless she was standing exactly where the trap was sprung." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a kingdom realizing it had bowed to a lie. Rosamond collapsed into her chair, covering her face. She was not crying for a lost love. She was crying because she was caught. Lord Thorn lunged forward, desperate, but Valerian's guards instantly forced him to his knees. Valerian stood up. His imposing frame cast a long, terrifying shadow over the table. "House Thorn is finished," Valerian declared, his voice carrying the full, crushing weight of the court's law. "Your ledgers are seized. Your lees are stripped. You will be escorted to the tower to await trial for financial treason and conspiracy." As the guards dragged a screaming Thorn and a sobbing Rosamond from the dining hall, the remaining nobles sat frozen in terror. The false bride was ruined. The court had been violently corrected, but the execution was not over.
Valerian turned away from the door. He did not look at the ministers. He looked only at Cordelia. Sighs. Before the entire royal council, the Duke of the High Court stepped out from the head of the table.
He walked toward the woman who had saved herself. And then, a man who bowed to no one lowered his head and bent his knee on the cold stone floor. I believed my silence would protect the situation, Valerian said, his voice thick with raw, public accountability. I failed you, Cordelia. I allowed them to humiliate you while I calculated a political escape. My power is nothing if it does not serve your truth. The court gasped. Cordelia looked down at the powerful duke kneeling at her feet, the broken diamond comb catching the chandelier light. The revenge was complete. 3 weeks after the High Court dinner, the Cathedral of the Silver Crown was bathed in the warm, golden light of early summer. The cold, suffocating dread that had once poisoned the royal chapel was gone, replaced by a profound and reverent silence. In the private chambers beneath the bell tower, Lady Cordelia Sterling sat before a gilded mirror. She did not wear the heavy, ruffled ivory of a politic.
Al pawn. Her new gown was brilliant, unadorned white silk, interwoven with delicate threads of silver. Reflective. It was a dress chosen not for a sacrifice, but for a coronation. Clara, now elevated to the position of chief lady-in-waiting, stood behind her. In her hands rested the diamond comb. The royal jeweler had returned it 2 days prior. The 12th stone had been reset into the silver, but at Cordelia's strict command, the damage had not been entirely erased.
A fine, frosted brace of silver secured the diamond, leaving a visible scar along the edge of the heirloom. It was a reminder that being mended was not the same as pretending a fracture had never happened. True dignity was surviving the break. "It is beautiful, my lady," Clara whispered, carefully sliding the comb into Cordelia's dark chestnut hair. Cordelia looked at her reflection. The woman staring back was no longer the obedient daughter of a terrified nobleman. She was the absolute master of her own fate. "It is honest," Cordelia replied softly. "That is better than beautiful." When she stepped out of the chambers, her father stood in the corridor. The Earl of Sterling looked older, his pride humbled by the sheer magnitude of the political storm his daughter had navigated without him. He bowed his head, extending his arm to escort her. Cordelia looked at the offered arm, then met his eyes. "I will enter by my own choice, father," she said.
Firm. It was not a punishment, but a boundary. The days of being handed over to secure a debt were over. The heavy oak doors of the cathedral swung open. Hundreds of nobles turned. This time, there were no vicious whispers hiding behind lace fans. There were no amused glances. As Cordelia walked down the center aisle, her steps echoing with measured grace, the highest lords and ladies of Oakhaven did something they had never done for a mere bride. Reverent. They bowed their heads in deep, silent reverence.
The court had learned to fear the woman who weaponized the truth. At the altar stood Duke Valerian Blackwood. He wore a ceremonial coat of midnight blue, the silver crest of his house resting over his heart. The terrifying, cold dictator of the High Court was gone. In his place stood a man who had lost his arrogance and found his equal. As Cordelia approached, Valerian did not wait for her to reach the highest step. He descended the marble stairs to meet her on level ground. He extended his gloved hand. He did not take hers. He offered his, waiting for her permission. Cordelia placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, strong and steady. "You came," Valerian said, his gray eyes softening with an emotion that was entirely unguarded. I came because I was not summoned, Cordelia answered, her voice clear enough to carry to the first row of nobles. I came because I chose to stand here. Then I am the most fortunate man in the realm, Valerian swore
quietly, and I will spend the rest of my life proving that my power exists only to guard your truth. Pause. The high priest began the ceremony. The vows spoken that morning were not the hollow recitations of a political treaty. They were promises forged in the fires of betrayal and tempered by absolute justice. When Valerian finally kissed her, the cathedral erupted not into polite applause, but into a thunderous, genuine ovation. Emotional. The kingdom did not just witness a wedding, they witnessed the crowning of their moral center.
Cordelia turned to face the court, her hand firmly holding Valerian's. The sunlight caught the broken, repaired diamond comb in her hair, flashing brilliantly across the marble walls. She had walked into the palace as a pawn, but she had conquered the kingdom as a queen. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments which moment proved she was the true queen. Do you believe a crown belongs to bloodline, to justice, or to the woman brave enough to stand before the court? And if you want more emotional royal stories of betrayal, truth, and queens rising again, please subscribe and stay with us for the next story.